Basu and Godin Notebook. 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 Basu and Godin.
Do you like my background, Arpin? It's a nice hotel room, and it's a beautiful room in Vancouver, British Columbia. That's where I am to cover the beginning of the Canucks Predators series.
Yeah,
so I'm seeing playoffs, man.
Yeah, I know. It's. I read your story from last night. You were clearly in Vancouver, and unfortunately, you should have set it up so that your camera could look out that window. Now, do you have a nice view out of that window?
No, there's an actually building under construction there.
Okay, so there's no mountains and no water and stuff. So that's because when I was in Vancouver, we did our podcast. I wanted to set it up so that you could see behind me because I had a beautiful view out of my window, mountains, water, all sorts of things. So
yeah,
I guess I lucked
at
out.
Windows is rarely a good idea.
Well, that's what happened. So that's why I couldn't do it. But anyhow, you were in Vancouver. You were covering the playoffs. I am in Montreal. I'm still covering the Canadiens somehow. But it got me thinking, actually, watching that game last night, especially in Vancouver, you being in Vancouver, reading your story, reading my colleague Thomas Drance's story in The Athletic, and when I was in Vancouver and you were here, we had a conversation about can the Canadiens do something like what the Canucks have done? And it was a big talking point among a lot of the Montreal media during that trip, just because it's so remarkable to see what the Canucks have done. And it strikes me watching that team, even that night, back then, but especially last night, what the Canucks did in the offseason is really backfill. They backfilled their team. They went out and got players they're familiar with. Obviously, Sam Lafferty, Teddy Bluger had gone through the Pittsburgh organization. And obviously, the big star of the game was Dakota Joshua, who was a Group 6 unrestricted free agent, which I don't really know the exact details of it. It was just basically a free agent who becomes a free agent because teams don't let him play enough games. Like it's basically that's how it works. So,
but that was 2 years ago. That was not last off season. That was
right. Yeah. So, but still, it's making less than $1 million on the cap. And it's really these players, Pius Suter, another one, these guys who have Ian Cole on defense, getting Zadorov. It's clear that Vancouver thought they had the high end guys that they needed. They just needed this support to play the way Tocchet wanted to play, which requires a lot of energy. You have to be in shape and you need depth. And you look around the playoffs and, well, first of all, just you being there and having been in this environment for a couple of days, what's your sense of their importance to what Vancouver's done? Because I think it's easy to look at Pettersson and be like, oh, he took a step and now he signed his contract and he's part of the core. JT Miller, had a phenomenal season. Besser recovered to have a great season. All these Quinn Hughes obviously goes without saying. All this really high end talent driving the bus. But do you get the sense that it's really those guys that have made the difference for the Canucks this season?
I wouldn't say so. I would say that the biggest difference makers remain Quinn Hughes and Thatcher Demko. But, if we draw a parallel with Montreal, the way that the players did when you were in Vancouver, it's probably easier to add quality depth to surround those high-end stars than to find the high-end stars to elevate your depth that you already have in the organization. Rick Tocchet wanted to instill a much more defensive, much more structured style of playing in Vancouver than what we would see under Bruce Boudreau, for example. And they wanted to limit turnovers and counter attacks and whatnot. And they were leaking high quality chances against. And so he tightened things up rather quickly, but for sure, bringing guys like Lafferty and Bluger, guys that help their PK, guys that help put like a defensive consciousness on scoring lines, because Lafferty is playing on the second line. Pius
Yeah.
Suter is playing on the top line. They really seem to be going by duos and have a complementary player who could actually play anywhere up and down in a lineup.
Mhm.
But you have to identify those guys, and not all these type of players are good. But I, ever since I had that chat with Eric Crawford, the director of professional scouting with the Montreal Canadiens, I really try to remind myself that a certain player might not play well on a certain team, but will fit exactly what some other team is looking to do, just because of style of play, opportunity, and whatnot. And Bluger has bounced around a little bit the past few years. Same with Lafferty, and they've really blossomed. They found their place in Vancouver. Are they the difference makers? I mean, Dakota Joshua definitely was a difference maker yesterday, but these other guys, I think they're just there to make sure that the structure that Tuckett wanted to implement is respected by everybody.
They're the
And
glue.
they become the glue, exactly.
Yeah.
But JT Miller has bought in so much, and he's become so productive, and it's quite interesting to see that you have these high end stars that produce a lot of points, with Brock Besser scoring 40 goals and whatnot. But this remains a team that shoots very little. They go for quality shots instead of volume. They're really in the mindset that Paul Byron used to be with the Montreal Canadiens. I'm going to shoot and risk losing the puck if I think that I have a quality shot in front of me. So, because they don't want to be put in a position where they're going to shoot the puck from any angle possible, and they might lose possession, and their forwards will be put in bad spots, and they'll be vulnerable to an odd man rush going back. So, just to wrap things up, I think that those support players, they make a difference, and they pop more in the playoffs, because the high-end guys tend to equalize, and cancel each other. And it's your depth, especially the third line. And that's what we saw in the Canucks Predators game last night, with Joshua and Lindholm really being standouts. And I would add Nikita Zadorov on defense too, who had a great game. But it's really your depth that makes the difference. But it's your big guys that carry you there. So if we want to connect this to Montreal, I don't think that Canadiens have the same amount of high-end players that the Canucks have, which would make a turnaround, the turnaround that they did as feasible with Montreal. It's not out of the question, but I don't think that it's as obvious. But their depth right now is occupied by younger players that they're developing, and even though adding guys like Bluger or Lafferty can be very useful for the playoffs, I'm not sure if the Canadiens are at a point where they could say, let's look for those guys. And I'm not sure if that's where the Canadiens are in their building arc.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone thought the Canucks were there either, but your point taken for sure. But you look around the playoffs, and there's definitely two separate types of teams. And there's a fair amount of this type. Like, there are teams that are driven by stars that the Canadiens will probably never have. Toronto, Boston, Pasternak, Matthews, Panarin in New York, I guess Ovechkin in Washington. But, Kucherov, maybe Matthew Tkachuk in Florida. But there are a lot of teams. Edmonton. Yeah, a couple of guys in Edmonton. But there are a lot of teams where the Canes might have the talent to match their best talent, Carolina, who has established sustainable success based on a model of just a very high floor of players. Like, listen, Sebastian Aho is a tremendous player, but I don't think he's quite superstar tier. I don't think it's unreasonable to think that Nick Suzuki could one day become a player like that. And if you just add other pieces, you can start doing the comparison game. And I don't think you should do that, but just the basic notion that you need a superstar anchor talent to go far, to be a top team, and win the Stanley Cup. Maybe it's true for the Stanley Cup, but I think it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out this year. I have Carolina winning the Stanley Cup personally, but they haven't been able to prove that their model works in the playoffs, even though you would think it would. Obviously, the Islanders are in the same boat. I would argue that Winnipeg, while they have some tremendous talent, both on defense, especially in goal, obviously, but at forward are a team that's kind of like that. Just a well-built, well-rounded team. Dallas is a great example of that to me.
They're my pick.
Vancouver.
They're my pick for the Cup.
Exactly. There you go. And Miro Heiskanen is one of my favorite players to watch, but is he an upper echelon superstar player? No, probably not. He's probably in the next tier of players. And the series you're covering, Vancouver Nashville, I think that applies for both. Although I would argue Roman Josi is a superstar defenseman, and Quinn Hughes is as well. But they just seem like it doesn't seem so unattainable for the Canadiens with the talent they already have, plus the player that they're going to pick at number 5, to be in a position like these teams are in if they do some smart things around those players. That's my takeaway after watching like pretty much every game 1 of the playoffs, except for Dallas, Vegas, and Edmonton, LA, obviously. But it just seems like I can understand why the Canadiens look at the teams that made the playoffs and say, well, we're not that far from maybe being one of those teams.
No, that's right. You're right about that. And as I was going through the mailbag questions, there was someone who was asking, will we see a team with a $10 million player winning the Cup this year? Half of the teams in the playoffs have a $10 million player on their roster, so there's one chance out of 2 that it might happen. But when I look at the Dallas Stars, who are one of the 8 teams that don't have a $10 million player, their highest paid guys are Seguin and Ben. I mean, they're still very good players, but I'm not sure it's them who are driving the bus anymore. So there's also that part where, everybody wants the Canadiens to add some high-end talent. I'm a proponent of that. Who would not be, actually? But I think that the financial situation of the team will also be very, very beneficial to them in creating an environment in maybe an horizon of 2 or 3 years where they're going to be able to invest big money and to make sure that they help attracting that high-end talent. That doesn't necessarily mean a 10 million player in any way. I think we made that point in an early pod, but it's not as much the salary anymore than the percentage occupied on the cap. That is really the main metric that's being used these days, just in order that, because there's going to be inflation and the salaries for the high-end players are destined to go up, you want to keep like the same frame of analysis from one year to the next. So you use percentage of the cap for that. But the Canadiens, they might not be spending for superstar money, but many of those teams that are in the running this year are not either. And they're trying to balance it out and try to make sure that, yes, they have very good players, but they spend smartly and they try to have enough depth. And I think that the Dallas Stars, in that sense, with good drafting also, are a great example of that. And I'm not convinced, though, that the Vancouver Canucks are one of those teams, though. We'll see about that. They've identified their core, they've locked them up, and they're going to go with it. Let's see. And it's the one, I guess the one guy they need to take care of is Demko at some point. But they, when you look at the Canadiens, like really, we've obviously talked last episode, all the players have talked about wanting to make the playoffs next year, and that's fine. We've talked about how the summer of 25 would be an important one. But when financially, the summer of 26 is when Carey Price's contract comes to an end, which it's also the year that Kirby Dach's contract comes to an end. So it's coinciding in a way that if Kirby Dach hits the way the Canadiens hope he will, and again, we mentioned last episode, we can't know that until he actually plays a full season.
Some of that money, a good chunk of that money, I would argue, probably would be earmarked for him if he winds up being as good as they hope. Slavkovsky, Canadiens are in an interesting situation with him. Would he be willing to fall into the envelope that Nick and Cole created as on their second contracts? Would he be willing to take something like that? Should the Canadiens offer that right away? It's a debate. I don't know if as a number one overall pick and just the great second half he had, maybe he'd be willing to bet on himself and wait. Could be, but if the Canadiens could get him at that number, that would be a coup in my eyes. Like that would really be a great thing, and then they would still have
similar salary than Suzuki and Caulfield. That's what you mean?
If they were able to do that, yeah. I mean that would be great. If I'm Juraj Slavkovsky, I'm flat out not doing that. I'm gonna gamble and hope that I can produce a full season's worth of what of what he finished as being since December, basically, and then really get paid. But I don't think it would create an issue. But anyhow, my point being that financially, the Canadiens are far away from having sort of the liberty to do whatever they want. They're gaining more and more, but the Gallagher Anderson contracts that run through 2027 are still a bit of a rock in their shoe. Next season, they'll have close to $4.3 million in dead cap. The Carl Larsson contract comes off the books this year.
Oh my!
Yeah, this is actually off the books. Basically, I guess now, more or less, it's probably done. So
that's funny.
That's a momentous thing, yeah. But yeah, still dead money on the cap, so still some financial cleaning up to do. But I mean, the question about $10 million players, I think is pertinent because, as you mentioned, half the teams in the playoffs don't have one, and which suggests that they don't have that upper tier, top end superstar talent, and they still manage to get to the playoffs. Now, we can have this conversation again in a few weeks and see who's still around when there's 4 teams left, and how many of those teams have $10 million players, and then that I think would, because when you look at the Cup winners, there's definitely been more Cup winners that were kind of superstar driven than not.
Yeah.
And so.
Yeah, because the St. Louis Blues are the outlier in that group. For sure. It's always been, whether you look at Chicago, Pittsburgh, like the Tampa, like the real dominant teams of the past 12, 15 years. Just for sure. There are superstars behind that. And I don't think it's a choice that the Canadiens are making, that they're not going for the superstar. If they could have one, they would get one. But there's a reason why generational players are called that way. It's because technically they come into once every generation. Mm-hmm. And by that calculus, I think that there's even too many generational players already. But they're hard to get. And the Canadiens, we'll see if they have. They're lucky at the lottery and they end up, they move up and they're in a position to draft Celebrini. I doubt it. But they have to go with
basic math tells you that they probably won't. Yeah,
exactly. So
I guess my point is that you don't necessarily
play
need
the hands that they're given, and go with what they got. And you cannot wait until the day that you're going to finally be able to draft number 1.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which they already did. And he looks pretty good. And he's not going to be. And I agree with you. The term generational gets thrown around a lot. I prefer to use superstar as kind of the tier of player that, and not term them generational. But yeah, you're Austin Matthews. You know who they are when you see them. Nathan McKinnon, Cale Makar, Quinn Hughes is entering that stratosphere probably. And so if the Canadiens. If Slavkovsky can become something like that, they have the potential. Maybe we still don't know that. I think his growth this year was really encouraging, but it's. I guess my overall point is that as opposed to a year ago at this time, I think there's a more clear path to how the Canadiens can build not just a playoff team, but a team that's solidly in the playoffs, that has a fighter's chance at winning a Stanley Cup within the next 3-4 years, on their current path. And obviously the pick at number 5, 6, or 7, or 1, I guess, or 2, whatever. Pick it most likely at 6, actually the best odds, coming up at this draft will be important to add to that core. But they don't necessarily need a huge hit either via trade or free agency. I think, or a home run as opposed to a series of singles.
Yeah.
Might be what they can do. When Ken Hughes says we want to add offensive talent, yes. Does that mean like the highest possible end offensive talent? Maybe. Does it mean just improving our scoring depth? And, like Slavkovsky, Suzuki, Caulfield, I looked this up for my notebook this morning. According to Money Puck, they've had the 4th most 5-on-5 goals in the league of any line. Any line in the league. They scored 40 goals at 5-on-5, 4th in the league. At goals per 60 out of lines who played together for 400 minutes minimum, they were 10th. So already you have like a pretty high end,
as good as result
piece of your team
in the current situation.
And now filling in behind it, yeah. So yeah, it's just a matter of filling in behind it and sort of managing to add, more possibilities of scoring. Like how many times this season, actually, looking through that Money Puck list, who's really good on expected goals out of NHL lines is Armia, Newhook, and Gallagher.
Really?
They were really high. They're really high on that list. Top 20, top 25, oddly enough. And so if you could have a line with Doc if you accept that as your key building block, that line, which who knows if they'll even keep that line together. Like you were mentioning kind of off the air that the Canucks go with pairings, or you just mentioned earlier that they have like kind of role players as the third guy. The Canadiens could go that way if they want to put Slavkovsky and Doc back together. Suzuki and Caulfield, and then and Newhook and someone, and then have guys that can fill in as a third guy. You've got pieces there. I think more than we might realize because they lost so often.
There's something I was wondering about, and I don't know, maybe you'll be able to chime in adeptly on the issue. But do you think that it's possible that the Canadiens can add high-end offensive talent, or great offensive talent to their group without giving up like that top 5, top 6 pick that they've got? Okay, do you think that there's a way where they have enough chips to get a top 6 forward and also be in a position where they can draft a Lidstrom or Lindstrom, or an Iginla if they scale back a little bit at the lottery? Or does it have to be one or the other, do you think?
I think they can add. That's kind of what I'm saying. High offensive talent, high end top 6 talent, probably not. Like the Canadiens have a lot of volume to offer on the trade market. They have that Winnipeg pick, so really Canadiens fans should be rooting for the Colorado Avalanche and then root for a whole bunch of upsets to happen in the other series, so that Winnipeg pick can get better. But and they have the Calgary pick next year. And so the reality is, Newhook was not a high-end offensive talent, but he's a top 6 potential guy that they acquired for a late first and an early second round pick. So that, if you're looking for that tier of player, then yeah, the Canadiens can add a bunch of them. They have a lot of tools. They have a lot of assets to add players like that. They have the assets to add like a real game-breaking, difference-making, borderline superstar forward. Probably not. Not without giving up something really good like a Reinbacher or um, packaging something around Matheson and a new hook or something like that. Like really giving up some really good pieces. And I know a lot of people want to trade Mike Matheson as soon as humanly possible, and see Lane Hudson as already ready to take his place, but I think the reality for the Canadiens is that they view him as a part of the solution here and as a way to either transition to being a good team or being a part of being a good team. He's not very old. His legs will probably slow down at some point, but I don't think he's close to that right now. So but again, you have to give to get. And it's clear that coming off the season he just came off, he would be a great trade asset, but so long-winded answer is I think the Canadiens would have to include that pick if you want to get a real bona fide superstar-ish player. I don't know how many of those are available. I don't know where they're going to find one. It's hard to. Those guys don't get traded very often. They're usually acquired in free agency. You don't see a trade like that happen very often without a similar player going back. It's pretty rare. It's pretty rare that you can build a package that's good enough to attract, at least in today's day. Like it used to happen more often, I feel. I just don't try to think of a trade like that. Like, the Flames trade Kachuk and they get Mackenzie Weegar and Jonathan Huberdeau. Now Huberdeau's been not good since he's been in Calgary, but he's coming off a tremendous season, was one of the best offensive players in the league. So like that's generally what you need to get players like that.
Yeah.
And either the Canadiens have players like that. I don't know if they're willing to trade them. It depends on what's out there, but I think they like the fact that they're building with Suzuki and Caulfield and Slav and Doc, and the guys that they have are part of the culture they're trying to create and have taken strides. Even Doc, even though he's been injured, is kind of part of that culture already. He's part of that group. So I think the most valuable asset they have is that pick.
Yeah. Well, they have 2 first-round picks next year too, so it wouldn't be impossible that they move their own pick in 2025 and they try to hold on to this one.
That would be really ballsy. I would really admire that. That would be such a baller kind of confident move. That would be a good message to send to your group. Look, we're willing to trade next year's draft picks. We think it's going to be in the late teens or the early 20s. Mm-hmm. And so now go prove us right kind of thing.
Yeah.
But that would be very not NHL. Most GMs are not.
Well,
you could slap protections on it, I guess.
That's it. Top 3, top 5 protection, whatever. But I don't know. I think there's ways to go about it. The Canadiens with their 2 picks. One thing also is when you look at there are tools now to calculate the value of a pick and what you need to package in order to trade up, or what can you get if you want to trade down. So the Canadiens could, if they were to move, let's say they draft top 5 and they want to trade up and get the number 3 pick, that would cost them the Jets pick.
Probably, yeah.
In order to make that move. So just in order to make sure that you get the quality forward that you want. But then you lose a trading chip if you were thinking of using the Jets pick for something else. So it's but the Canadiens have a lot of draft capital. We've been saying over and over how they're not going to use all those picks. I think that a ballsy move is probably what's needed at some point to make sure that they go. They jump into they seize the opportunity that's in front of them, because otherwise if they wait and they play too safe, too prudent, it might be good but just not good enough. But
that's just to kind of bring it back is why it got me thinking about some of the things the Canucks did to fill in to fill in that glue, to get those guys to complete the pairings up front, to get the guys like those are important moves as well. That either they do it this year or they do it next year, but at some point they'll need to do it. Like it's, unfortunately, like Brendan Gallagher would be a perfect guy like that if he wasn't making $6.5 million a year. No, but they have him and he's going to be here. So he's a guy like that. Army is going to be the last year of his contract. Maybe he signs at a more reasonable number and he becomes one of those guys or he's gone. But the Canadiens are going to need to improve the depth of their team up front. And I think it's a lot more important than people are giving it credit for because there's been so much emphasis on adding the high-end talent in Montreal for so long. And people have been so desperate for this. There still has not been a point per game player in Montreal since Alex Kovalev. Nick Suzuki fell just short. So that streak continues. So I get it. I get why the emphasis is on that. But you look at some of these teams like, Adam Lowry in Winnipeg is their captain and he's just a beast. Like he is just like just an amazing hockey player, just so good and so important to what that team does. Was definitely in my consideration for the Selke ballot this year. Like it was
his defensive numbers are amazing.
They're off the charts. He faces tough competition and like those guys in the playoffs are when they really stand out. If you have a guy who can shut another team's top line down and thereby freeing up your own top line to play against lesser competition, it's gold in the playoffs. It's absolute gold. Like you need that. And and honestly, like a guy like Christian Dvorak, and I know a lot of people kind of make fun of him because he's so sort of vanilla and blah and whatever, but he's a guy like that. He's a guy, if he wasn't making what he makes at almost $4.5 million a year, he's a guy that that's why I think that the Canadiens, if they wanted to, would be able to trade him at the deadline next year if he's able to stay healthy, and if they're not in playoff contention. But because teams need guys like that. Teams need guys that can win draws, play against top players, kill penalties, do what he does. And so.
Yeah, but you remember how Burge used to say that there are players that lead you in the playoffs and other players that help you go through the playoffs.
Do I ever remember?
Yeah, so
he said it once a month.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, I think the Canadiens first order of business in making sure that they have enough players that get them to the playoffs before you start thinking about what sort of support role players could help us go through the playoffs. Don't you think?
Well, yeah, but I think those support players also help you get to the playoffs. I honestly believe that. Like, especially in a long season with injuries and whatever, like, having those players that you can elevate temporarily, but who fall back into a proper chair when you're healthy, they're important. And I look at Vancouver and I get your point that yes, the difference makers are their stars. But those stars were there last year. They were there.
Yeah.
These guys weren't, and it's putting your stars in a position to play at their best. It's making sure that you're not trailing so that often, like it's being able to put your depth lines out there and feel relatively confident that they're not going to give up a backbreaking goal that you're going to have to make up for. It's all these things over the course of a long season, I feel it really help. And we've long talked about the whole strong link, weak link thing. And whether hockey is a strong link sport or a weak link sport, and I think it's both. I don't think you have to pick one or the other. It's both. So it's really a matter of just picking your lane, and sometimes the lane is picked for you because you have what you have in terms of strong link players. And then if you have to pivot to becoming a weak link team and just raising the floor of your team, I think there's multiple teams that are currently in the playoffs that have shown that is also a decent team building model to use to get success, even if that model has not resulted in the ultimate success that often. I think outside of the St. Louis Blues in recent years, we have not seen that model succeed, but I'm wondering if that time is coming.
Yeah. All right. It's time for Monday Mailbag.
We do a mailbag every Monday,
Let's go to the mailbag.
to us.
Okay, so we have a lot of mailbag questions, which is why there's so many. So we're just going to hit them. We'll get to as many as we can, and then we'll see where we go. So here, why don't I start?
Sure.
I'll start because I was actually here. So David Kerr asked us on X, does Montreal management like JF Houle and Laval, or do you think they have their own coaching candidate? So I was at Laval's sort of exit meeting day yesterday on Sunday morning, and obviously Houle's future was a big topic of discussion with him. JF said he would like to be back. Ken Hughes was asked about it. Gave a kind of a non-committal answer, but said that they're going to look into it. What was striking to me was seeing the unanimous support Houle got from the players that we spoke to, and not just the players, but the veteran players, the guys like Mitchell Stevens, Gabriel Bourque, Toby Bisson. Toby Bisson had mentioned after the game in Belleville, I believe, how he didn't particularly like that a guy like Galipo had to sit in the last game, because the Canadiens sort of parachuted in all those guys to try and win that game, which they didn't. But it speaks to the push and pull balance of managing an AHL team, how you have to make decisions like that are sometimes imposed on you by management. Houle had to do that a fair bit this season. Armia goes down to Laval at the beginning of the year. Jacky goes down. Barron goes down. Players that the Canadiens are invested in for the future of the organization, and that ice time comes at the detriment of a veteran AHL guy who's been there all year and who's fought hard to help this team win. I think Houle's done a good job of managing that. And one thing that I think is his best quality, and that what the Canadiens probably like, is that the Canadiens development staff is very present in Laval. I was there once when the development staff ran the whole practice. JF Houle didn't do anything. Just watch them. Not every coach would be open to that. Not every coach would feel self-assured enough and open enough to allow Adam Nicholas and Scott Pellerin to run an entire hour and a half practice. And this was crazy. They zambonied the ice in this practice between the two sessions because there was so much going on. So I think that willingness and that openness is a good trait of JF. The fact that his players fully went to bat for him is a good trait. And so we'll see. I'm not making any predictions. I don't know exactly what the Canadiens are thinking, but I think for the mandate he was given in Laval, he's done a pretty good job of it.
I'll just add quickly to that. I was watching recently the latest season of Drive to Survive, and there's the team principal of Red Bull, Christian Horner,
Yes.
who talks about the drivers on AlphaTauri, and he says we put drivers in the AlphaTauri seats because we groom them. We picture them as potential future Red Bull drivers. Mm-hmm. And if at some point, if we stop considering them as future Red Bull drivers, why do we leave them there? Mm-hmm. I think that it applies to the coaching job in Laval too, because
100%.
Yeah, so it's not that the Canadiens are already thinking of the after Martin St. Louis. No, but what they need to do with their unique situation with the language and all is that they need to provide the whole league with French-speaking or bilingual head coaches, so that those guys might be coaching somewhere else, but they develop their craft on some other team and they become candidates. A situation like André Tourigny, He hasn't gone through the Montreal system, but he's out there, and it's good for the Canadiens that option one day might exist.
Mhm.
Now, if they don't consider JF Houle a future head coach in the NHL, then I think that there's a question legit, no matter how good a job he does in that specific role. But if it's a priority for them to make sure that they have the widest number of candidates possible for the job, if they don't picture him as a head coach in the NHL, they have to look for someone that, in their eyes, down the road could be one. So that would be the only issue I think I would have.
I would normally agree with you, and I think historically this should have been the case for coaches in that position. But I think with the sheer number of young players who are about to flood the Laval Rocket, adding to who's already there. Reinbacher might start the season there. He actually said he was open to it at his exit meeting. You might have Lane Hudson there. You might have Luke Tuck just arrived at the end of the season. Owen Beck should be there. Meshar will probably be there. There's going to be I think the mandate in Laval has grown past the phase of let's groom our next coach there. It's at a phase where you almost want a coach who's willing to lose. You almost want a coach who's willing to go through some growing pains to get these guys NHL ready. And I think Houle this season demonstrated that, he played those kids. Mm-hmm. He knew it was going to lead to losses, and he played them, and they got better. And eventually the team got better too. And so I think I 100% agree that the Canadiens should try to do that under normal circumstances, but the Canadiens have never had circumstances like this where there's so many potential NHL prospects arriving in Laval, and you have this guy that needs to manage that situation, make sure the team is competitive while these kids also develop. It's a very tough ask in that league. When you look at the playoffs, you look at the end of the AHL playoffs, year after most years, it's usually veteran-heavy teams that make it through the AHL playoffs. Yeah. So you rarely see a situation where a team has successfully managed to load their team up with promising young kids who got their development and also got to win and do all. It's hard to have your cake and eat it too at the AHL level. Most of the younger teams either get knocked out early in the playoffs or don't make the playoffs at all, as was the case with Laval. And so a lot of those teams that wind up winning Calder Cups or what have you, I mean, the exception would be like John Cooper's Hershey team, right? Where they had all these, they had Killorn and Palat and all these, Tyler Johnson and all these guys who eventually formed the core of the Lightning. But usually they're guys where you could identify maybe 2 or 3 legitimate NHL prospect. They're really AHL veteran heavy teams often. So it's a tough kind of mandate to pull off. So that's why I think the Canadiens are going to try to pull that off. And I think Houle knows the deal, understands that mandate, and is more than willing to execute it. And that's a good quality for him to have for this organization at this time.
Yeah. I think that for John Cooper, you meant Norfolk, not Hershey.
No, Norfolk, I did, yes. Yeah, that's right.
Okay, Mathieu Bertrand is asking us, if the Habs draft a forward with their first pick this year, how likely is that pick to make the team at training camp? Are the top forwards NHL ready? I would venture to say that outside of Celebrini, I don't think that any of them would be in the NHL next year. Demidov could probably be ready, but he's under contract in Russia for another year, so you have to forget him. Lindstrom, I think there's an issue with mileage when it comes to him. He's only played 32 games with Medicine Hat this year. He's not going to the under-18 Worlds. So yeah, and I think that he lacks some reps. So I'd be very surprised that, considering the amount of games that he played and the fact that there's been such a jump forward from last year to this year, that he would he would have like a real chance of sticking in the NHL next year. Honestly, I don't see many of those forwards really challenging for a spot in the NHL next year, and that doesn't really matter. I think that if you look at the year after next, it's already more feasible for Lindstrom, for maybe for Yzerman, for Iginla, guys like that, Katin. But as 18-year-olds, you have to know that you have a specific type of player that can more than survive in the NHL, and that you're in a situation also as a team where having him on your team versus sending him back to his junior team is benefiting. And I don't look at that group of forwards. It might change from one year to the next. The number of players that stay in the NHL right after their draft, it fluctuates from one year to another. But I look at that particular crop of forwards, and I'm thinking that outside of Celebrini, it might take a little bit. Doesn't mean that they're less good. It's just that you don't want to rush things too much.
So just to further your point, if you look at the 2022 draft, Juraj Slafkovsky's draft, there are only 9 players who have played more than 10 games, 2 seasons removed from that draft. 9 players in the entire draft, not just in the first round, the entire draft, who have played more than 10 NHL games. The 9th is Shane Wright at 16 games. So it's just not, and this is something the whole Slafkovsky sort of roller coaster should have taught us, is it's just not like it was for a long time, where you play in your draft plus one is spent in the NHL is a more rare thing. It's a rarer thing now than it used to be. And so the smart move, and the move that most teams take, is to have guys play their draft plus one where you drafted them, or in the AHL. I mean, that if you have a European player that you can put in the AHL, then so be it. Put him there, but it's rare.
Mm-hmm.
9. There's 9 guys. 2 years later, 2 seasons later, 9 players from 2022 have played 10 games in the NHL. So just keep that in mind. Okay, let's go back. So I'm gonna do this. This one's fun because this one came on email. It's from someone named Alim. Alim says that I want to believe that I'm the only listener from South Africa, Johannesburg. Although I know you're probably, that's probably unlikely given how great your podcast is. Thank you, Alim. He goes on, very, very complimentary of the podcast, but not going to bore our listeners with that. But thank you, Alim, for the compliments. So he has a question from Johannesburg. He also, Marc-Antoine says, if we are ever in Cape Town or Johannesburg, that he would love to buy us a drink. So I would love to take.
My brother-in-law's from the area, so one day maybe.
Yeah, there you go. So yeah, I would love to take them up. Cape Town would be a dream destination for me. So Alim's question: how do you feel about the insiders and what tensions they feel between having access and the importance of reporting real stories? How do you two manage that tension in ensuring some accountability? It's a big word. Hockey's just a game with players and coaches versus ensuring you don't piss anyone off and lose that connection. Do you ever hold back asking a difficult question or persist a bit because you're trying to manage access? So, Alim, it's a good question, and it's definitely part of the gig, in the sense that as a beat reporter, you're dealing with these people every day. As an insider, you're talking to these decision makers in the NHL every day, and if you don't get that, if you don't get that access, you're not going to be able to do your job. So there's a line there, and I think different reporters have different ways of managing that line. It's a very difficult thing to establish and to understand. You do, at some point, you establish a line that you're comfortable with. And me personally, I'm not an insider. I'm not a newsbreaker. I try to get insight from sources on the team, and you do want to maintain those relationships, but I don't think it should be at the detriment of your coverage. But that's because of the job that I do. People who are paid to break trades and to break scoops and what have you, you need that access. And so that line has to be maintained, or that relationship needs to be maintained. So yes, I'm sure decisions are made and I don't even know what they are, but that's part of that job. It's a reality part of that job. You're not going to break those trades or break that news if the people making those moves don't trust you to tell you about them. So there's always been a clear 2-lane. Well, there's many lanes actually, but there's 2 lanes that you can go, 2 primary ones you can go in this business, writing or talking about the game of hockey. One is that, breaking news, breaking trades, and being an insider. And the other is sort of covering the game, covering what's going on, getting different perspectives. I think that's what we both try to do. Yes, we love to break
beat
news.
Writers, so.
We're beat writers, exactly. But, there are beat writers who break news. I think like Larry Brooks for the longest time now he's more of a columnist, but for the longest time was a New York Rangers beat writer, regularly broke news while on the beat. Michael Russo, same deal, beat writer who regularly breaks news. But it's a good question, Aleem, just because, yes, you have to do that sometimes, but I don't think, and you know what? We're gonna see it in action next season. I think Martin St. Louis is going to be under some different lines of questioning next year. I don't think losses will be kind of, I don't want to say ignored, but really not be the primary storyline after a loss. Like, I think the result of games will become probably more important, and he's going to be questioned on some of his decisions more often than he has since he's been hired. And we'll see what happens to that relationship. Marty's very cooperative with the media, like extremely cooperative with the media, because frankly, no one has really criticized him yet. So I'm curious to see how he's going to be when that criticism comes. But as a beat writer, that naturally has to change based on circumstances and context. It's not quite the same as what the insiders have to manage in terms of maintaining those relationships and what have you, but there is a small element of it for us too.
All right. I think that Trevor Cassidy has sent this one question 2 or 3 weeks in a row, so I'm going to answer it now. You could pick one outcome this year. Habs make it to the Stanley Cup Finals this year, healthy, and have to play Vegas, or they win the lottery and get first overall. Which would you choose and why? Well, to me, it's a no-brainer. I take the first pick overall because and getting to the Stanley Cup Finals is great. I don't think that Vegas actually is somewhat vulnerable. They're beatable, and when you look at the group of teams that are there, it's a good opponent ultimately to have, even though they're Stanley Cup champions. I think that they're not the best team right now in the NHL, and there are others that are better contenders for the Cup this year. So going back to the Stanley Cup Finals would be great story. But what the Canadiens keep saying, they talk about sustainable success. If I'm in a position where I draft Macklin Celebrini and I add it to my team, well, I know that down the road, adding a guy like Celebrini to the group that the Canadiens have already, ultimately I will get to the Stanley Cup Finals down the road, and more than once. So I think that's what you look at when you talk about sustainable success, is give yourself an opportunity to be in conference finals many times, Stanley Cup Finals at least a couple of times, and give yourself a chance to win the Stanley Cup on more than one occasion. So you need a difference maker, and if you get the first overall pick on most drafts, you will get that difference maker. So to me, there's no hesitation about which one I would take out of the two.
Yeah, I am in full agreement of that. Let's go to one from it's from Joel Gabet. So he says Marc Antoine eloquently put it on your Friday podcast that the summer of 2024 will be the trade and the summer of 2025 the UFA signing. So he has put together a list of trade targets from most likely to least likely, wants to know what we think. So I will read it out and then you can tell me what you think. So number 1 is Travis Konechny. Number 2, Trevor Zegras. Number 3, Marty Necas. Number 4, Kaapo Kakko. Number 5, Pavel Buchnevich. Number 6, Brock Besser. Number 7, Clayton Keller. Number 8, Kent Johnson. Number 9, Joel Farabee. And number 10, Jack Quinn. What do you make of this?
That's a good list. First of all,
It's not
that's
bad.
a good.
Yeah.
I think that it's a reasonable list. It's not a pipe dream list. I like that.
There's logic behind every name on that list.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm not sold on Kakko, and I don't unless he comes at a bargain. You buy the pedigree or the potential, okay, but he doesn't come on the top of my list. Clayton Keller, I don't think that Salt Lake City will let him go. He's a high price guy, but I don't think that unless he desperately wants out of Utah, I could see a reason or two to do that. But I don't. I think he's going to stay there, and he's no matter how talented he is, he's not that big of a player. That's another guy. Smaller player too, Konechny. Right now, he's in his prime.
Plays bigger though.
He plays bigger. That's a guy that I really like. But you have to. You're closer to a win now mode with this guy because it's not. You don't get him for what he's going to give you in 3 or 4 years. It's for what he's giving you now. But the style of play, the rambunctious attitude, I love that player. But to me, I think Jack Quinn is an interesting idea because he's been hurt a lot, hasn't been able to really showcase himself too much. But the Sabres are at crossroads, and they'll try to mix things up a little bit. First with a coaching change, but probably on their roster too. They've got a lot of skill, a lot of talent, but probably not enough diversity in terms of types of players. And they might choose to move one of those guys. And Jack Quinn appears to be someone that could be of interest. So,
well, especially Joel mentioned that specifically for a right shot D.
Yeah,
because that's what they need in Buffalo.
That's what they need. Yeah,
they have they have all the left shot Ds you could possibly want.
Yeah, but I think that, and we'll probably have the opportunity to go more in depth about those two guys. But to me, Zegras and Necas remain the two, not necessarily the best candidates, the ones I would like to see the most, but they appear to me like the most likely, the guys that fits, and that for whom the circumstances seem to be the most fitting for the Canadiens right now. It's a good list.
It's a good list. I would add the one name that to me is a bit of a long shot is Farabee. He's got a lot of years left. He's got 4 years left on his contract at $5 million a year. I think they see him as part of their future. They have him signed. He's one of the few guys signed past next season. So, along with, unfortunately for them, Couturier. And Owen Tippett is another guy that they locked up. So it's really strikes me that they view him as part of their core. The other thing I would mention is Besser is interesting to me just because he's entering the final year of his deal. He's already at 6 and change. Can they even afford to keep him at the number that he's going to require? But you would want to see it again. You'd want to see what he did this season again. But that guy's been in trade talks forever. So we'll see. But it's
in Vancouver, him and Garland, separately expressed an interest to leave at some point.
Yeah.
And this season has served as, make up with their team, and so everything seems to be settling down now, and Besser has the best season of his career.
Yeah, but I mean Besser's name's going to pop up on trade lists for sure. you're entering the final year of your deal, like it or not, and the Canucks, they have Pedersen's extension kicks in next season. That's a $4 million raise on this season. And as mentioned, Demko's contract is up in 2 seasons. And so at some point you're going to need to, at some point you're going to need to plan around things. And is Besser a real core guy for them? Maybe, but maybe not. I don't know. It's something that they're going to have to consider. And maybe they'll just keep him as an own rental and be like, well, screw it. We'll just try and win with this guy. And then when he hits for UFA, we'll have to let him walk. And that's that. So
I think that the idea that, that he would show next year that he can do what he did this year is probably go a long way in determining what they do with him. But
yeah, that's fair. But it comes down to, cap's going up. Maybe they can find money for him, but money seems to might get a bit tight over there because they do have to take care of they have Philip Roenick that they need to take care of this year. Like their entire defense is either an RFA or UFA, basically. Yeah. Other than Carson Soucy and Quinn Hughes and Noah Juleson, they don't have a single defenseman signed past this season. So there's a lot of money that's going to end. Philip Roenick's next contract's going to be fascinating because we were talking earlier about what's changed. Well, the Canucks got roasted for that trade, like completely roasted. Everyone's like, what the hell are you doing? You're trying to do 2 things at once. It makes no sense. But talking about guys that are different from last year to this year, having Philip Roenick to play with Quinn Hughes has made a big difference. And he makes $4.4 million a year, and he's not going to be making $4.4 million next year. So
when you got a duo like that, you try to a pair like that, you keep it together.
that's definitely becomes a priority over Brock Besser, right? In terms of allocating your dollars. Like it's, Tyler Myers is a free agent. I don't know what they're going to do with him. Like they're going to have to spend a lot of money on their defense. And so Besser might shake free as a result.
So we had a listener from South Africa. We have one from England. Gilzy36 says, are the rumblings about the Habs playing a European game in Paris true? If so, I best get saving. France is much easier to get to from England. So yes, those rumblings are true. Nothing has been confirmed yet when it comes to a game in Paris, but the target is for 2025. So if it's
25, 26, we should specify. Like that's that season.
Yeah, exactly. But
yeah,
I mean that's what they're looking at. Well, the thing is generally they will start the season with those European games. That's why I'm talking about 2025.
Right.
So if for some reason it takes a bit longer to finalize, it would go to the next season. But the Canadiens are aiming for the 25-26 season for that to happen. So it's more than rumblings. It's definitely something that's in the process of being done.
Right. Okay. I'll also do a quick one because something has actually changed here. So I'd say once a month we get a question about the Sean Monahan trade and the conditional pick attached to it. We've gotten it again. Chris Lesperance. Has this pick been determined for us yet? For us lay people, LOL. Well, something has changed in that sense. So it is actually worth pointing out that the Canadiens would have had the option to take Calgary's 2024 pick in the first round if it fell between 20 and 32. Now, since Calgary did not make the playoffs, their pick will not fall between 20 and 32. So Montreal will not have that option. So now it necessarily moves to the 2025 draft. And Chris, I'm sorry, I'm not going to go through all the things, but basically the most likely scenario is that Montreal will get the better of Calgary's or Florida's 2025 first round pick next season. Well, I said that 2025. So they will get the better of the 2 picks. Now, there are all sorts of different scenarios. Like the Calgary pick that's if both Calgary's and Florida's picks are not in the top 10. If Calgary's pick falls in the top 10, which I suppose is possible, but is not likely. And Florida's pick is not, then Montreal gets Florida's pick. But anyhow, there's a very, very unlikely scenario that would result in the Canadiens having to take a pick in 2026 instead. In all likelihood, it's going to get settled next year, 2025. They will have a first round pick, probably be Calgary's first round pick. So let's see what happens. But one of the condition number one in this trade is already known to not be happening. So that's actually a development in this story that we wanted to mention.
It'll be good. The day that this is done and that the headache that all those conditions represent, once it's behind us, I think the world would be a better place for it.
The day that they announced that trade and I looked at the conditions for the first time and realized that I have to write about this, I was just depressed. I just got washed with this wave of anxiety and depression. I'm like, what am I supposed to do with it? Was on the press release, it was a full page worth of text to explain it. So I agree. Hopefully we no longer have to deal with that after the 2025 draft. But until then, we do.
Okay, let's go to the emails. Man, there's a lot of emails.
There's a ton. Yeah, we're a lot.
Yeah. Okay. Let's see here. There was one that I wanted to. Where was it? There was one. Okay, there you go. This one is from Alexander Richards. A few episodes ago, it was mentioned that the scouting staff was pretty much the same as it was under previous administration, and the main difference was more data input and Bobroff being in charge instead of Timmins. I was wondering if the positive progress we've seen from Harris, Struble, Roy, Tuck, Jacky, all non-first round picks made by Bergevin and Timmins, might be more proof that the main problem with previous administration was actually yet more proof that player development, not drafting, spotting the potential Timmins per se. Well, Jacky was not a draft pick. He was signed as a free agent. But I get your point, Alexander. And I think that Timmins has gotten a lot of flack for his drafting record. He had an amazing 2007 draft. And after that, it sort of went downhill for many years after that because, among other things, the Canadiens did not have a lot of draft picks. So they needed to hit on those few picks that they had. But between 2008 and 2016, the Canadiens were among the teams that had the least number of picks. So that played against Timmins. He made some questionable choices in hindsight. But unfortunately, we're not like Biff in Back to the Future 2. We don't have the book, the cheat book that says who turned out well. Just like the winners of those racehorses competitions. So I think it's a fair point. I think that the biggest change that the new administration brought was how they decided to put in the rebuild of the Canadiens a focus on player development. Marc Bergevin used to, that was at least my interpretation of it, he used to picture player development as the path that a young player takes from the moment he's drafted to the NHL. And when he gets to the NHL, then he becomes an NHL player and the development per se is done. Whereas the mentality with this current administration is there's development done from 18 years old until the guy is ready to retire or is clearly in decline. But what has changed a lot, because I chatted with Paul Byron about that recently, and eventually I'll finish writing that piece. I need to write that piece. With my long chat with Paul Byron, but he said, back when I was a player, it's true we didn't have Adam Nicholas around. We didn't have, two guys like Rob Ramage and Francis Bouillon. Actually, it's three with him also. So it's the bigger player development team that it was back then.
Marie-Philippe Poulin too.
Marie-Philippe Poulin too.
Yeah.
When she's not busy getting standing ovations at the Bell Center.
Yeah.
Woo! And obviously we've gone through that before, but the analytics department was non-existent under Birch. But the whole league has gotten more specialized also compared to what it was 10 years ago. So the way that the Canadiens have established their player development mentality and their structure, I don't think it existed in many teams. It existed in Toronto, going back to pretty much when Kyle Dubas first started. He tried to put that, to lay out those foundations, but and that way the Maple Leafs were very innovative. And I remember we had a podcast a few years ago when we were talking about the idea that Canadiens could start a department of innovation because they were clearly lacking in that sense. So I think that Gorton and Hughes have really brought the Canadiens up to speed with the modern era. And it makes it so that all of a sudden some picks from Trevor Timmins start to look not as bad. He's hit on a few 7th round players too. Joshua Roy looks like a home run as a 5th round pick. And some of those, later 2nd round picks, such as Jaden Struble, are looking great too. So it's really the onus or the stigma on Timmins will remain his 1st round picks, where the Canadiens have just not been very effective in that sense. And he'll carry forever the decision to prioritize Kotkaniemi over Brady Tkachuk. And, just going back to the list that Joel Gabé put out in terms of potential acquisitions, if there is a world where Brady Tkachuk can be made available, he would be my guy. My goodness.
Yes. He's a tremendous player, yeah. And I think it's pretty safe to assume that the current scouting staff never would have let him get by them. As evidenced by the Slafkovsky pick. Like, it's really and frankly, if Caden Lindstrom's there when the Canadiens are going up to the stage, I would imagine for the similar reason that he would be their guy. I don't have any insight on that. I don't have any inside info on that, but I just feel he fits all the things that Ken Hughes said that he wants to add to the team. The offensive talent, the physicality, it's all in one package. So anyhow, that's let's leave it at that. We had a lot of questions. We're really sorry we didn't get to more of them, but we can answer these over the course of the off season here. We'll keep them. We don't delete the emails. So, but yeah, Marc-Antoine has to get to has to do his job. Has to go cover the playoffs and not talk about non-playoff teams like the Canadiens are. But maybe next year at this time we'll be talking about the Canadiens in the playoffs. You never know. So thanks for listening or watching. We'll be back Friday with another episode. Future Friday will be in full effect. And until then, enjoy all the hockey. I have been enjoying watching it. Marc-Antoine enjoyed covering it and watching it live. I'm a little jealous, but at the same time, no, because I get to sit on my sofa and have a beer while I watch the game. So,
I'm jealous of that. Is it Friday that we're going to do our Doc and you hooked up a trade thing?
We're gonna see. We're gonna try to do, because that takes a lot of work. That takes a lot of groundwork and a lot of things that have to be done and discussions. So we're gonna try for that. I don't want to promise it because you're on the road. We'll see how things go. I have a couple of things I need to do, but we'll try for that episode to hit on Friday, because if there's been one mailbag question we've gotten more than any other, it is definitely what is the next Doc Newhook trade. So
that and stuff about Ivan Demidov, which we'll really get to the bottom of it, but we have to put ourselves in a position where we're going to be able to get a bit more intel. So if you people are patient, there will be draft-oriented episodes coming your way in the next little while. I mean, it's going to be the natural course of things. So hang in there, people.
Once we put this season to bed, well, myself personally, you put the old season to bed and then you start digging into the draft. So that's coming in the next little while. But anyhow, Please tune in Friday. Happy for tuning in. Thank you for tuning in today, and we'll talk to you at the end of the week.